The rain came down in thin, stinging threads, a cold veil that blurred the cemetery's white marbles into a gray wash. Nora Bennett's hair clung to her temples beneath a borrowed black umbrella, and the scent of soaked grass and lilies settled in her lungs like a funeral hymn. The last handful of earth had fallen with a hush that sounded like a door closing from the inside. People murmured condolences, gloved hands pressed hers, and then one by one they drifted away, swallowed by the wet afternoon. She stayed. The umbrella shuddered in the wind. She traced her father's name on the newly carved stone with the pad of her thumb, as if she could warm it back to life. The world felt wrong, misbuttoned. She thought of the way he used to hum while making coffee, off-key and soft, and something inside her crumpled, as if a delicate latticework of hope had been burned through. Her father was gone, and with him the last steadying weight that had kept the rest of her life from tipping. That small, stubborn piece of hope followed her into the attorney's office later that day, like a ghost that didn't realize it had died. Mr. Merrick's office was a shrine of quiet dust and leather, crowded with books that smelled like old promises. He offered her tea he didn't know how to make, and handed her a stack of papers that knew how to hurt. The numbers were tidy, the language precise. Her father, brilliant and trusting, had signed certain documents in a season of illness and bad timing. Business loans he had co-signed. Medical bills that multiplied when he wasn't looking. The words came in a kind voice, but each one landed like a stone in her stomach. "The bank will be foreclosing on the house," Mr. Merrick said softly. "I am very sorry." 30 days. He pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose, regret tugging at his mouth like a man who wished the law would make an exception for grief. The house. Their little two-story on Willow Street, with the cedar swing that creaked in the evenings and the kitchen window that stuck in summer. Every wall there had held a season. Pencil marks from childhood growth spurts on the pantry door, a water ring from a Christmas punch bowl they never buffed away because it made them laugh. It was all she had left of her parents' jokes and their arguments and their quiet. Now it was a line item on someone else's ledger. She went home and began packing on muscle memory. A life reduced to cardboard, to tape, to small labels written in a shaking hand. Books, office, mom's china. She stacked a box and sat on it and tried not to hear the house breathe. 2 nights passed like fever dreams. She woke each hour not to a sound but to the someone-shaped absence that echoed through the rooms. The knock arrived on the 3rd afternoon, quiet and precise, like someone announcing a verdict. Nora opened the door and the world shifted. He stood there pressed into a navy suit that fit like a secret, rain beating on the shoulders and running down to shine like ink along the hem. His face was handsome the way cliffs are, clean lines and remote. But it was his eyes that made her feel as if she'd stepped into a courtroom without counsel. Cool, assessing, not unkind so much as uninterested in kindness. "Miss Bennett," he said, voice low, smooth, and perfectly modulated. Adrian Blackstone didn't require an introduction. His name was a skyline. A legal titan, the man corporate enemies cursed and whispered about over neat scotch. The CEO whisperer who turned catastrophes into compliance and walked away without a scratch. He didn't hold a sympathy bouquet. He did not ask for permission to step inside. "If you're here to offer legal services," Nora said, her grip tightening on the doorknob, "I can't afford you, Mr. Blackstone." A flicker crossed his eyes, an arithmetic thought, calculating and resolved. "I'm not here to offer services." His gaze moved over the neatly labeled boxes, the tired lamp, the framed photo of her and her father on the mantel. "I have a proposal." He stepped across the threshold. It felt like a drop in temperature. "I will settle every cent," he said simply. "Your father's debts. The liens, the bank's foreclosure. You will lose nothing." The words were so bluntly generous, they rattled the bones of her grief. For a flicker of a heartbeat, hope rose in her throat, so sharp it hurt. She blinked into the sharp cologne of cedar and rain that followed him. "Why?" Her voice broke on the single syllable. He turned the full weight of his gaze on her, and something like steel slid into place behind his pupils. "In exchange," he said, almost gently, "you will marry me." The air vacated the room. Nora pressed a palm flat to the stack of boxes to keep from swaying. She tasted iron. He was beautiful and terrible in the way of disasters seen from far enough away to admire their symmetry. She wanted to laugh and slam the door and hurl the nearest coffee mug in one motion. "Why?" she asked again, because it was the only thing she could find. "That is not your concern." He let the silence bloom and harden. "But there is one condition." She let the fragile thread of hope spool back into its spindle. "What condition?" Her voice sharpened, protective, as if she could stab him with it. He didn't move. He could have been carved from the same wood as her dining table. "It will be a marriage in name only," he said, as if dictating a clause. "A partnership for 6 months. You will move into my penthouse. We will attend essential corporate and social functions together. And in public, we will present a united front." "In private?" She hated herself for asking. "In private," he repeated. "We will live entirely separate lives." The glare of his certainty threw the shadows of her life into stark relief. She pictured herself a ghost in some high-rise museum, her presence and installation no one touched. "And your condition?" Nora pressed, though it felt like pressing her hand to a flame. He stepped closer, rain-silvered, cedar and cold air trailing behind him. His voice dropped, and the softness made it worse. "No emotional involvement," he said. "No sentiment, no romance." He let that settle and then finished, the quiet of it more dangerous than a shout. "Above all, no intimacy. We are business partners, Miss Bennet. Nothing more. If any emotional or physical line is crossed, the agreement terminates. The debts are reinstated, the foreclosure proceeds, and you will lose everything. There are moments that change shape under your eyes, like glass being blown on a breath you don't control." It was monstrous, diabolical in its elegance. He wasn't buying a wife, he was negotiating rights to a shadow. Selling her life to him on paper, but barricading her heart and body with a wall of injuries she would be punished for scaling. The prison was made of rules so cold they steamed in the warm room. She stared at his beautiful, unfeeling face and felt hate move through her clean and hot as whiskey, burning as it went. But then her mind betrayed her with images. Her father's hands on the porch rail, the way he'd sigh after a long day and say, "Home, kiddo," a little awe in his voice, every time. The walls in the house seemed to lean in toward her, reminding her that memory lives in paint. She was out of moves. Hope was a graceless, practical thing sometimes. It wore work boots. Nora swallowed, felt a single humiliating tear tickle a cold path to her mouth, and whispered, "I accept." Adrian didn't smile. He gave a single, precise nod, as if marking an item off a list. He slid a leather-bound folder onto the top box. "Read it," he said. "My legal team has been thorough." He turned toward the door. "My driver will collect you tomorrow morning at 9. Be ready." He left without looking back, and the house resumed its breathing. Nora stood in the silence as it filled in around her like water. The folder sat like a weight. She whispered the word contract aloud, just to hear it sound less like a sentence. It didn't work. The next morning, the elevator opened directly into a glass and concrete cathedral with a view that made the city look like a map he owned. The penthouse was a gallery of curated emptiness, expensive furniture that never knew crumbs, a fireplace with no ashes, a bookshelf so careful it insulted books. There were no photographs, no magnets on the fridge. Even the air felt professional. "Mrs. Blackstone?" said a voice thin as piano wire. A severe, rail-thin woman appeared like she had stepped out of a starched history. Her gray hair was drawn into a bun that gave her cheekbones orders. "I'm Mrs. Pratt." Mr. Blackstone's housekeeper. "I will show you to your suite." The word suite clanged inside Nora's head like a joke she didn't get. Mrs. Pratt's eyebrows nearly lifted when her gaze flicked to Nora's single, scuffed suitcase. "The East Wing," she said, and Nora nearly laughed at the idea of living in a house that used the compass. The rooms were beautiful and sterile, as if someone had poured sunshine into a lab. "As agreed, the master suite is on the west side," Mrs. Pratt explained, and the geography of their distance felt cruelly efficient. "Mr. Blackstone has arranged a wardrobe," she added, opening a door to reveal a walk-in closet that looked like a boutique had quietly died in it. Dresses in midnight and cream waited on padded hangers. Shoes gleamed like knives. Handbags blinked open on their shelves like docile animals. Everything in Nora's size. Everything a reminder that this was a machine and she was a component. That night's sleep felt like something other people did. The penthouse held silence like a person. It shifted and leaned. She lay awake, watching the ceiling turn from gray to lighter gray, then threw off the heavy duvet and padded barefoot through the hall. City lights made patterns on the polished floor, long rectangles like the bars of a cage. She wanted water and movement and proof that she wasn't dreaming this. He stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, a figure carved from the night. The city threw itself at his glass and slid off. He had shed his jacket and loosened his tie, the top buttons of his white shirt undone. In that dim blue light, he was changed, less perfect, more human. He cradled a glass of whiskey in one hand, in the other, a silver-framed photograph that he was staring at like it had teeth. He felt her in the way some people feel storms. He startled, a small, unguarded flinch, then placed the photograph face down on the console with a swift, guilty care. She had time to see only the suggestion of a woman's profile and hair like dark silk. And then the window light turned him back into himself. Insomnia? His voice, low and rough around the edges, had lost its courtroom polish for a beat. It made her heart race for reasons she couldn't afford. "Just thirsty," she said. The word "just" sounded ridiculous. He turned fully to her. The softness shuddered. He was a lock again. "Remember the rules, Ms. Bennett," he said. The deliberate use of her maiden name was a slap with gloves. "Maintain your distance." He left without waiting to see if she obeyed, but it was too late. The crack had shown itself. There had been a photograph. A woman in a silver frame he hid when he saw Nora. Curiosity, unwelcome and bright, began to creep into the places anger had been living in her. Their first appearance in public made the papers before the entree touched tablecloth. The shareholder dinner for Blackstone Law was a nest of sleek suits and sharper eyes, all networked with threads of capital and whispers. Photographers were a flock of small, merciless birds when they stepped out of the car, and the flashbulbs made Nora see stars. "Smile," Adrian murmured, his palm finding the small of her back. The touch was cool, formal, and proprietarily possessive in a way that made her breath go shallow. "You are now a Blackstone," he said under his breath. "Act like it." She did. The stylist he'd employed had chosen a gown in storm blue silk that moved like night. Nora slipped into conversations and out again, with a grace honed by years of being polite among the powerful without belonging to them. She smiled, nodded in the right places, kept her eyes mild and her mind attentive. But at the bar, where the bartender wiped circles into glassware that cost as much as a decent used car, her test arrived in silk and diamonds. "Mrs. Blackstone," the woman said, tasting the name with a little curl of her lips. Victoria Blackstone was a legend, wrapped in pearls, her bob perfectly angled, her eyes sharp and pale as winter sunlight. "So you're the girl who saved the family home. A sentimental purchase," she added, casually venomous. "My son has been known to indulge charitable impulses." The words were needles. Deliberate, dainty, meant to remind Nora she was a transaction wearing perfume. Before Nora could respond, another voice, warm with malice, slid into the space beside them. "Well, well," said Damien Cross, arrival with a smile like a blade's curve. He took in Nora's gown and the hand at the small of her back. "I see you finally made an acquisition in the domestic market, Blackstone." He turned the leer on Nora. "Tell me, what was the closing price on this one?" The nearby clink of glassware paused, breaths held like cocktail umbrellas. Adrian didn't hurry. He moved toward them with a calm that was more dangerous than any rush, and the crowd parted as if they felt the temperature drop. He placed a hand on Nora's arm with a protective ease that seemed to come from some uncontracted place in him and looked straight at Damien, not at his mother. My wife, he said in a voice so quiet people leaned in to hear, is worth more than your entire portfolio, Cross. Remember that. He didn't stop there. He let the weight of his stare fall on his mother with a coolness that looked like respect, if you didn't listen for tone. As for my charitable impulses, he added, I'm simply protecting my most valuable asset. The room laughed the way rooms do when they've decided who wins. The double meaning was neat and cruel. It was theater. It was contract. And yet Nora felt the pulse in his hand change, a small throb under his skin that didn't care who was watching. He bent to her ear, breath grazing her skin, and said, Shall we go? It wasn't a question, but he made it sound like one. In the car, silence seat-belted itself in between them. Thank you, Nora said at last, fingers twisted together in her lap. He didn't look at her. It was part of the agreement, he said too calmly. Protecting the investment. But she had seen the way he had gripped the wheel hard enough to whiten his knuckles when Damien smirked. She filed away that careening spark of truth. This wasn't about a line item. It was about her. A week later, obligation put them at the Grand Hall for a charity art auction that made the city's cultural elite buzz like bees in a glass hive. Nora's heart tugged when they walked past the sculptures like thoughts you could trip over, the canvases where people had hung their storms and their small clearings. For a minute, she forgot to pretend. The old part of herself, art history student who loved paint and patience, rising like a friend she hadn't seen in years. She stopped in front of a small landscape that didn't shout for attention so much as ask you to come closer. A horizon moody with rain, a pale band of light like the last hope of a day. Her fingers twitched with the muscle memory of writing a paper. It's beautiful, she whispered, almost to herself, stepping closer to trace the brushwork with her eyes. It is, said a voice you instantly wanted to say yes to. She turned to find a tall man with kind, easy features and the relaxed polish of someone born to be photographed next to donations. Ethan Vale, he said, smiling as if they'd discovered the piece together. Philanthropy is my day job, but I come here for the lessons in light. They fell into conversation, the kind that breathes fast. He made her laugh with a quip about an overpraised installation in the next room, and she surprised herself with an opinion that sparkled in the air between them. They leaned in, heads tilted, smiling over brushstrokes and atmosphere. Adrian stood close enough to hear, still enough to be carved. He held a glass of champagne, as if it were an object he'd been told to hold, and something in his jaw ticked like a metronome speeding up. He watched Ethan smile, Nora's lighting face, and he felt a cold, inconvenient tightness in his gut, like hunger you don't admit in public. When the landscape came up for auction, Ethan's paddle rose at once, buoyant. A fine choice, he said toward Nora, and there was that wink. But across the room, an assistant held a phone to their ear and lifted a paddle, and suddenly the air changed. The anonymous bidder countered, silent and immediate every time. Numbers climbed, pitching laughter to hush. Ethan raised his paddle again and again, caught by the crowd's appetite for spectacle and the sudden desire to be the story. In the end, the anonymous bidder named a number that silenced even the gavel. "Sold!" cried the auctioneer, his voice cracking with delighted disbelief. Minutes later, a young auction house assistant approached Adrian with a beautifully wrapped package and discretion in his eyes. "Your acquisition, Mr. Blackstone." Nora stared, stunned, then a little furious for reasons that felt embarrassingly personal. "Why?" she asked, her voice low. Adrian's mouth didn't offer a smile. "I don't like to lose," he said. The words were clipped, but a note under them trembled. Ethan appeared, all good sportsmanship and polite eyebrow. Adrian stepped forward slightly, his hand finding the small of Nora's back again, this time with a pressure that brooked no negotiation. "I believe our evening is over," he said to the space instead of to Nora. But the sentence was aimed clearly at Ethan, and the growl in it didn't belong to any contract. Nora let herself be guided away, heart-tapping quick, uneven notes. As they left, the understanding rose inside her like a small, dangerous sun. This wasn't about winning a painting. It was about not losing her. The following weekend, Blackstone obligations put them in a different kind of cage. Victoria's country estate, Blackstone Hollow. A stone manor that wore autumn leaves like a crown, and a November wind like perfume. The house was a museum of family history, where warmth had been catalogued and stored in a locked drawer. Victoria greeted them with a smile that showed all her teeth and none of her welcome. Nora was given a bedroom with a view and a list of dinner times, as if that were hospitality. But the distance from the city peeled layers off Adrian she hadn't seen. She woke early to find him in boots on the muddy path, murmuring to a grizzled golden retriever with dignified eyes. "This is Atlas," he told her, and the way he said the dog's name made something inside her lean in. He stood with her in the old library and let words spill about the original builders, the way the banister had been carved by a man who signed the underside with a nail. He loved this place. Maybe he loved the boy he had been here. She watched the armor loosen. Saturday night, the fragile truce shattered. They were gathered in the living room, the fire burning like wealth, when the front door opened in that way people do when they know they will be adored. A woman stepped in, tall and elegant, and shimmering with the kind of confidence that comes from growing up at the center of every circle. "Adrian, darling," she sang, a glittering ache of familiarity in her voice. "I heard you were in town. How could I not stop by?" Nora knew her face. She had seen it in the silver frame Adrian hid. Dr. Celeste Harrington moved through the room like it was a memory she had given them, kissing Victoria's cheek, letting an uncle make her laugh at an old joke. She reached for Adrian's arm like the story had paused and was ready to resume. "It's been too long," she trilled. "We must catch up." The air in the room thickened, cozy with a history Nora wasn't invited to share. The names they tossed like playthings had stories attached, summers, scandals that never stuck. Nora sat with a glass of wine that tasted like the stink of overripe peaches and tried to shrink herself. Adrian stood there, caught between the woman he used to imagine a life with and the woman he had a contract with. He glanced at Nora now and again with something like apology in his eyes, but his mouth did not form an introduction. He let the people in the room completely fail to see her. The pain was a blade put through her cleanly, without flourish. She had told herself a story. This was paper, not love. Business, not want. She'd almost believed it. Seeing him beside Celeste, beside laughter that treated her like a ghost, she knew she had been lying to herself. The truth was small and devastating and unavoidable. She had fallen in love with her cold, complicated, contractual husband. She stood up on legs that obeyed because they didn't know what else to do. Conversation faltered. "Excuse me," she said softly to the room. She made her way out the door, past portraits that watched and weather that didn't care. The night air hit her with a clean slap. She walked into the garden, down the gravel that tried to make noise to prove she existed, and into the dark until the house's warmth was aglow behind her like a promise kept to someone else. Rain began soft as an apology and then decided it meant it. She didn't turn around. The wrongness was a thunderhead inside her. Tears came and no one could tell because the sky was crying too. But she could feel her own heat in the cold, and it made everything hurt worse. His voice snapped when he remembered the rule. "Nora!" He came up behind her, rain flattening his hair, suit clinging without dignity. He stopped a few feet away as if there were lines painted on the path that he was still trying not to cross. "You'll get sick," he said hoarsely, as if that were the wound he could heal. "What does it matter?" she shot back, the words snatched by the wind and flung back in his face. "I'm a line item, aren't I? A repayment plan wearing a dress." The word debt hit him square. He flinched as if it had mass. "Who told you that?" The question came out dangerous and quiet. "No one had to," she said, turning to him, rain weighing her hair, dress clinging like accusation. "I'm not stupid, Adrian. This whole charade, this marriage, it's because you owe my father something, isn't it? Say it. Say the truth out loud just once." He looked like a man who had finally been dragged to the edge of a cliff and told to jump or die from standing still. "Yes," he said, the word ripped out of him. "Your father made me promise. He asked me to take care of you." There it was. devastation. Oddly gentle, because it confirmed what she had already feared. She was a responsibility, a debt paid with signatures, not a partner, not a choice. "So that's all I am to you?" she asked, voice breaking around each word. "A promise?" He opened his mouth to explain. She stepped back as if words could burn. "I don't want your charity," she screamed over the rain, the storm answering in the trees. "I don't want your protection. I want to go home." She ran, not caring how she looked. He watched her, and all his careful systems groaned. He ran too. The promise to her father mattered, yes, but the image of Nora disappearing into the dark alone was unbearable. He caught up with her on the long private road, his fingers closing around her arm, and then gentling, as if he remembered what he was holding. Rain soaked them clean through. It felt like a baptism that didn't take. "You can't go," he said, desperate now, voice raised to compete with the storm. "Not like this." "Let go," she said, tugging against his hand. But there was defeat in the fight now. "I am done being your project, your good deed." "You're not a good deed." It burst out of him, and something broke free. "You're a complication," he shouted back, a wild edge in his voice. "You are the most illogical, infuriating, completely captivating variable that has ever entered my life." "Give me one reason to stay," she demanded, rain and tears making her eyes blaze, the pain there turning him inside out. "One real reason, not a promise to a dead man, not a debt. One reason that belongs to you." He had made a life of words, of building arguments that left rooms breathless. But in that moment, the words fell away like cheap scaffolding. The truth he wanted to give her was tangled with a promise he had no right to break. He stood there stupid with love and fear and something older. He couldn't offer her a speech. So he did the one thing that had nothing to do with contracts and everything to do with breaking them. He kissed her. It wasn't the kind of kiss that apologizes. It was messy, furious, a confession without vowels. He tangled his hands in her wet hair and gathered her, and she felt the careful man she'd been living with dissolve in his own arms. All of it was there, frustration that cut him up at night, jealousy that made him buy paintings like bullets, fear of wanting, and the love he still didn't know how to carry without putting it down to write clauses about it. The rain came harder, like the sky wanted to erase the edges of them. For a second, instinct made her push him away. Then some other instinct, older than rules, surged, and she lifted her arms and wrapped them around his neck and kissed him back with everything she'd locked up to survive. Pain and hope and confusion and something that felt like relief poured into it, until they were both out of breath and clinging as if that were the only thing keeping their feet on the ground. They pulled apart, foreheads resting together, rain stitching cold lines down their faces. The rule was rubble at their feet. The contract was just paper. "And now what?" she whispered, hope sneaking in against her better judgment. "I don't know," he said, and somehow the honesty in that made her feel steadier than any polished vow. He took her hand, and they walked back to the glowing house together, wet and changed, not knowing what they were exactly, but not lying anymore. They stepped into the foyer, and the temperature differential made them both shiver. Victoria and Celeste stood in the entry like statues placed to impress, their expressions arranged into disbelief and disapproval. Their eyes moved from the wet clothes to the locked gaze between Nora and Adrian, and something old and brittle cracked. They could smell the shift in the air. The game, careful and brutal, had changed rules. The next morning, Adrian found Celeste in the breakfast room, pouring coffee that steamed politely. He stood like a verdict and said, "Things have changed, Celeste." It was a clean cut. She left without making a scene because her pride demanded privacy. Then he stood in front of his mother, who wore disbelief like a new brooch. "You are choosing her?" Victoria asked, incredulity underlined with lineage. "A girl with no connections. Over your family's reputation?" "Perhaps," he said, voice steady, mouth softening for the first time. "And for the first time in a long time, I feel sane." But it wasn't Adrian who made the final incision. Later, in the library, he looked like a man who had put a match to his own life and was now watching it burn with an awful kind of relief. Nora stood in the doorway like a breeze, steady, "I'm leaving," she said. Panic swam up in him. "No, we can figure this out. I chose you. You broke a rule in the rain," she said quietly. That wasn't a choice. It was a reaction. She inhaled the heavy library air. "Our contract is broken. The terms are void. I'm going home." The word home tilted something sweet inside him, like a drawer sliding open. He stepped forward and stopped, learning the new boundaries as he went. "You need to figure out what you really want, Adrian," she continued, voice gaining strength from its own honesty. "Not what you feel when you're jealous or cornered. Do you want me, or do you just not want to be alone?" She paused at the door. "When you figure it out, you know where to find me." Nora's departure was a clean amputation. He returned to his penthouse and found it had turned itself into a mausoleum while he was gone. He walked through rooms that had once been a fortress and now felt like a museum of how not to live. He sat at his desk and stared at the chair where she had once curled, and he heard a piano in a room they didn't have. He tried to concentrate on briefs and filings and clients who had built their lives on his ability to fix things other people had broken, and he couldn't. He realized she had been right. He had kissed her out of desperation, and 100 other stormy feelings he had never let run without a leash. What did he feel now, in the light, in the quiet? Love. It arrived as a simple sentence and knocked him out of his chair. Love, not the complicated performance he'd rehearsed with Celeste, not a promise paid like a bill. Love like wanting to hold the part of herself that lit up when she talked about a painter nobody else in the room cared about. Love like wanting to be the place she could set down her grief and be seen and not be made to apologize for how heavy it was. Words wouldn't be enough. She didn't trust his words, and she was right not to. The only thing that mattered now was the one thing he had been ordered never to share. He went to the safe and spun the dial with hands that shook. He took out a sealed, yellowed envelope his father had given him long ago, with instruction to use it in a true emergency. A phrase he had mocked for years, because he had never believed in that kind of drama. He knew now that life had been waiting for this moment to use it. He broke the seal like a spell. Inside was not a legal document, but a letter in earnest, looping script. Robert Bennett, Nora's father, had written it to Adrian's father in the worst week of Adrian's life, weeks after the scandal that had almost erased his future. He read it and felt his chest close in stages. The scandal had been a frame, done elegantly cruel by Damian Cross's firm. The evidence had marched in neat, implacable lines, and Adrian had stood on the edge of losing everything, with his mouth too dry for argument. Robert Bennett had discovered the truth. He had also been handling a quiet mess of his own, a minor mistake unrelated but devastating enough for a man who worshipped his reputation. A mistake Damian had learned about and pulled like a thread. Robert made a choice that only men of a certain interior architecture make. He sacrificed himself. He resigned in disgrace, signing a confession that felt like swallowing a knife, because it convinced Damian to drop the charges and burn the evidence. He asked only one thing, that Adrian never be told, lest the debt become a prison, and that, if anything happened to him, the Blackstones would see his daughter cared for. Adrian sat with the letter like a boy lost in a new city. His entire life had been scaffolded by a sacrifice he had never acknowledged. Gratitude, he realized, wasn't the point, honor was. He couldn't give Nora a fortress and call it love. He had to give her the one thing her father had lost for him, the truth, brought into the light with his name on it. He drove to Willow Street, the house with the swing and the sticky window. It felt a world away because it was. Nora was in the yard, kneeling by a rose bush she'd coaxed back from neglect, sleeves pushed up, hair in a messy knot. She looked up when she heard his car door, expression guarded and tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. He didn't start with explanations. He put the letter into her hands like an offering. "I think you deserve to know the real reason," he said quietly. She read, standing there in the garden, the thorns holding their breath. With each line, her eyes widened and then softened as grief and pride twisted together. Robert Bennett had saved a young lawyer's career by letting his own reputation bleed out behind closed doors. He had done it because he believed in a man who hadn't learned yet how to believe in himself. "I need time," Nora whispered, the words trembling. "I need to think." "I know," Adrian said, the words catching because for the first time he was not trying to persuade or control. "Take all the time you need." He left, because that was what you do when you love someone who deserves all the space in the world to become herself without your shadow in the doorway. The days after that were a corridor with no doors. He went to work and found himself reading the same paragraph 3 times. He deleted texts he wrote and rewrote. He didn't step onto his balcony because the city looked too much like a story of himself he wasn't sure he wanted to be in anymore. Meanwhile, Damien Cross felt blood in the water. He came to Nora through a mutual friend who shouldn't have agreed to the coffee, sat across from her at a comfortable cafe and leaned in as if they were collaborators. "Adrian Blackstone uses people," he said, silkily sympathetic. "He used you. He used your father." He slid a folder across the table as if it contained a favor. "I have documents," he said, voice full of generous darkness. "Not illegal, but ugly. Public relations nightmares. We could make him pay." Nora stared at the folder. It was heavy, with the kind of things that move stock prices and ruin sleep. She could imagine the headlines. She could imagine the brief, sour taste of satisfaction, followed by the jaw-aching guilt. She thought of the cold, immaculate man who had walked into her house and written the worst kind of rules in her life. She thought of a jealous buyer at an auction, of a man who had stood in a dark room and looked at a photograph like it bit, of a kiss that had broken something open inside her that had never closed right to begin with. She closed the folder and looked up. "No," she said, the word clean. She pushed the folder gently back across the table. "My father was an honorable man. He believed in Adrian Blackstone. So do I." She stood. She left Damien Cross blinking after her. His smile slipping, the weapon he'd extended returned politely and placed at his feet. She walked into the late afternoon with a kind of calm battle music rising in her chest. She did not go home. She went to the only place that mattered because that was where the battle was. She let herself into the penthouse with the key he had curled into her palm weeks before, and found him in the study, a king fallen off his throne and trying to pretend he'd meant to sit on the floor. He turned when she came in, surprise and something like fear in his face in equal measure. "I'm not here to talk about us," Nora said, voice steady with a new kind of strength. "I'm here because we have a problem." She placed Damien's folder on the coffee table without ceremony. "Damien Cross is trying to destroy you. He tried to use me to do it." He looked from the folder to her face, and the understanding that moved through him felt like a fever breaking. She had not chosen to stand behind him. She had chosen to stand beside him. She had brought him the arrows before they were shot. "My father believed in you," she said. The sentence had the finality of a brick clicking into place. "He sacrificed his name to save your career. I will not let another man tarnish that legacy with lies." He found himself standing straighter. He had spent weeks talking about honor to himself like a habit. Now it was here in front of him, in boots and a ponytail, stating it like a mission. Words were no longer currency. Action was. He called a press conference and the markets thrummed like a struck string. That morning, every journalist within 100 miles descended on a sleek glass atrium, expecting an apology and a resignation, expecting a new lie polished until it glittered. Adrian walked to the podium without notes, a man who had finally thrown his script into the fire. He looked out over cameras that felt like weapons, and he didn't flinch. "I called you here," he began, voice carrying without strain, "to right a wrong that has stood too long in shadows." He didn't talk about stock or strategy. He told a story about a man with a spine that wouldn't bend. A man named Robert Bennett who taught a young lawyer what the world calls integrity, and then paid for it with silence. He told them about the sabotage engineered to ruin him by a rival whose name he now let hang in the air like a charge, Damien Cross. He let the wound be seen. Then he showed them. On screen behind him appeared scanned letters and dates, and the purpled bruises of corporate malice, evidence of the frame, the proof of the sacrifice. He gave Robert Bennett's name back its light, not in a settlement filed quietly in a drawer, but in a room full of blinking recorders and the internet's insatiable mouth. He didn't stop with the past. "The man behind that original conspiracy," he said, voice turning colder and more precise as it cut through the oxygen, "is again attempting to manipulate the market and destroy my company, this time by attacking the character of those I love." He found a camera lens and looked into it as if it were a person he was speaking to with a private, hard promise. "He will not succeed. We have provided evidence of his past and present crimes to the authorities." He paused, let silence do work. Then he let himself be seen. "I have spent years trying to repay a debt of honor in secret," he said, voice thickening as it found the things it had been circling. "I built my life on rules and control to protect myself from a world I believed was irredeemably corrupt. But a woman of extraordinary strength taught me that the truth does not live in shadows, that walls are not a refuge, that vulnerability is not weakness, it is courage." He let a breath shudder through him. "My greatest honor is not my business successes. It is trying to be worthy of the legacy of Robert Bennett and of the love of his daughter." He had burned it all down. He had set fire to the part of his life that insisted only winning mattered. He had torn down the screens he'd hidden behind and let everyone see the man behind the armor. The city reacted the way cities do, with noise and awe, with cynicism and tweets, with the sudden recalibration of allegiances that tell you what survival looks like in rooms where money decides who is invited. Nora watched in her father's living room on a second-hand couch that felt like a throne now. She pressed a hand to her mouth and cried the kind of tears that come from the place where grief and relief finally agree to stop fighting. He had done it, risked his career, his privacy, his meticulously built machine, for her father's honor and for hers. He had chosen truth over comfort. He had chosen hope over control. That evening, his car pulled up at her curb. He didn't stride to the door with the assurance of a man used to being let in. He stood on her porch like a kid who'd walked to a friend's house to confess breaking a window and had only his apology to recommend him. He didn't knock because he wouldn't presume, not anymore. She opened the door. They stood and let the quiet fill in everything words were tempted to over-explain. He looked tired in a way that wasn't about sleep. The sharp mask of him had been put down for a while, and it made his face almost unbearably human. "That was the bravest thing I've ever seen," Nora said finally. "It was the only thing that mattered," he said, honoring him. "And hoping," he added, voice ragged, "that I could prove to you I am trying to be a man worthy of what he gave up and of what you deserve." She stepped aside. "Come in, Adrian." They didn't sit in the formal living room where the couch had too many ideas about posture. She led him to the little den in the back where the afternoon light made dust look like gold. 2 old armchairs that had known naps, a side table with a water ring. They sat and the ghosts were kind. They spoke without tactics. He told her about the way success had tasted stale since he was 26, because the chalk dust of a boardroom where a good man had been quietly erased had settled in his lungs and would not leave. "It felt like I was living a life that belonged to him," he said, "and I was too cowardly to say his name aloud." She told him about walking through the world after her father's death like she was underwater and everyone else had gills. About the humiliation of needing help and the pride it took to ask for any. "I spent so long hating you," she admitted, a sad smile bending her mouth. "It was easier to hate the man with a tower than to admit the ground had just opened and swallowed my life." "I did take everything," he said, "because there's freedom in stating your failures plainly. I took your home and your choices and called it necessity. I put you in a cage and wrote a contract to make it seem civilized." "No," she said, leaning forward, steady. "You gave me a chance to fight back on a field where you knew all the rules. You were just too blind to see I wasn't going to be a pawn." He met her eyes and let something like joy move the corner of his mouth. "You were always 10 steps ahead of me, weren't you?" "Always," she said, and the shared smile set something down softly between them. Their quiet new truth. The conversation softened, warmed around the edges. They talked about what they wanted when no one else's invitations mattered. She told him about wanting to go back to school, to spend afternoons in studios that smelled like turpentine, to put together programs for kids in neighborhoods where art class had been cut and the only paints came from dollar stores. He told her he was tired of building only engines that generate money. He wanted to build a machine that could heal. He reached into his jacket, fingers slow. "I love you, Nora," he said, voice sure now and gentle. "I have no right to ask for anything. I know what I've done, but there are two things I need to put in your hands." He set a small velvet box on the table between them and didn't open it. Then he pulled out a single antique-looking key. The brass warmed from being held. "This is the key to this house," he said. "The deed is clear. It's yours. No strings, no contracts, no debts." He slid it toward her with 2 fingers, as if he were careful not to touch an altar. He tapped the box. "And this is not a demand. It is a question. I want you to have your freedom entirely, but I hope, more than I have ever hoped for anything, that you will choose to let me be a part of your life." He stood because that was what the new him did. He gave people the room to choose. "The choice is yours completely." "Adrian," she said when he reached the doorway and the future had stepped into the hall, waiting for one of them to choose a direction. He turned, face raw with terror and hope. She looked down at the key, at the box, at all the possible versions of her life sitting quiet and steady on a table that had been her father's. "I don't want you to move into my life," she said, and watched hope dim. Then she smiled, slow and bright. "I want you to build a new one with me." She crossed the space that used to feel dangerous and slid her fingers into his, the fit so simple it almost hurt. The kiss they shared in that doorway didn't belong to a movie's thunderclap. It was the exhale people make when they get home from a long drive and sit in the car in the driveway for a minute just to be grateful. It was a beginning, and not a dramatic one, a real one. The weeks that followed were quiet, on purpose. They did not rush back into black cars and flashbulbs. He did not move in and set his briefcase beside her coffee maker. Instead, he brought coffee some mornings, setting it on her step with a smile and a thumb brushing hers that still made her stomach flip, because gentleness has its own electricity. He showed up with Thai food and made faces when it was too spicy, and she laughed at him and watched him eat anyway. Evenings were conversation and comfortable silence, the space between them learning their names in a new language. He learned how she liked her toast. She learned he said her name like he was tasting it. There remained the last wall, his mother. Victoria Blackstone's silence after the press conference was a statement carved in marble. One Sunday he arrived with nerves he couldn't disguise. "My mother has requested our presence for lunch," he said, guilt and defiance old and heavy in his voice. "You don't have to go," Nora took his hand. "We'll go together." The lunch was as warm as a boardroom in January. Victoria's dining room gleamed. She asked about the weather and spoke of a charity gala and did not look at Nora long enough to make an opinion count. Afterward, coffee was poured in a drawing room designed to impress donors with taste. Nora placed her cup on a saucer with care and decided she'd rather stand in a storm than sit in a draft forever. "Mrs. Blackstone," Nora said, her voice calm and respectful, designed to reach across a table and be heard. Both mother and son looked at her, startled. "I know I'm not the woman you would have chosen for your son." Victoria raised a perfectly arched eyebrow, conceding the obvious with a delicate nod. "And I know our story began in a way that was unconventional," Nora continued, "and wrong by any reasonable measure. But I need you to know this. I love your son. I love who he is and who he is trying to be. He makes me happy, truly happy." She let the words sit there, simple and bare. "I am not asking for your approval. That is something I will earn or fail to. I'm asking you to see your son, to see his happiness. Isn't that what matters most?" Silence lengthened. Victoria looked at Adrian, and the way he looked at Nora changed the lines in his face. There was light there she had never seen, a softening around the mouth, a steadiness in his eyes. He looked alive in a way that had nothing to do with winning. The ice in Victoria's gaze melted in cautious degrees. She stood and walked to the mantel, opened a small ornate box, and took out a pair of sapphire earrings that caught the afternoon light like water. "These belong to Adrian's grandmother," she said, voice softer. "She fought for what she wanted. She would have liked you." She placed the earrings in Nora's hand. "Welcome to the family." The blessing was not an embrace, but it was as close as this house knew how to come, and it landed like an absolution. Later in the week, Adrian took Nora to an empty loft in the Arts District, a light-splashed space with high ceilings and hope. "What is this?" she asked, stepping into the dust that danced on the beam of late sun. "Our new headquarters," he said, a boyish pride slipping into his voice. He handed her a leather-bound portfolio that turned out not to be a contract, but a blueprint of a future. "The Bennett Blackstone Foundation," she read, the name making her chest ache in a way that didn't hurt. "I keep thinking about what you said," he told her, "about building something that heals. We'll fund arts education in schools that need lifelines, scholarships for young artists who hear no too many times. We'll put your father's name on the door." He looked at her like a man placing a heartbeat in someone else's hands. "I don't want to be your boss. I don't want to be just your husband. I want to be your partner in everything." She laughed, surprised by how happy it sounded. "That," she said, "is the best proposal I've ever heard." Their real wedding ended up as far from their courthouse transaction as a winter morning is from a long hot night. It was small, on the grass of the Willow Street backyard that had learned to bloom again under Nora's hands. The roses she'd rescued were in full fragrance, and the sun slanted gold over a handful of people who knew them well and wanted the right things for them. No reporters, no corporate deals sealed with handshakes over champagne. Just friends. Victoria with genuine warmth in her smile, and a cluster of board members from the foundation who had already rolled up their sleeves. Nora didn't wear a dress with a famous label. She wore one she had designed herself, elegant and simple, a dress that didn't pretend it wasn't there. She walked the short, grassy aisle on the arm of a family friend with tears in his eyes, and looked only at Adrian, who stood under an arch of white roses. No armor in sight, his expression open and full of a love that didn't apologize for itself. They had written vows you could speak in a backyard without sounding foolish. "Nora," Adrian began, voice rich with an emotion he no longer hid, "the first time I met you, I saw you as a solution to a problem. I have never been more wrong. You were not the solution, you were the truth. You taught me that a life built solely on control is a prison, and that strength comes from choosing to love even when it means letting yourself be hurt. I promise to honor the sacrifice your father made with every decision I make. I promise to try every day to be worthy of the staggering love you have shown me. I love you." "Adrian," she said, joy steadying her, "I met you the day everything in my life was broken, and I named you the storm. You were not the storm. You were the shelter, even when you didn't know how to be. You taught me that my past isn't the only story I get to tell, and that trusting again is not weakness, it is the greatest strength. You see me when I feel invisible, and you hand me a megaphone when I can barely whisper. I promise to always see the man behind the armor, to be your partner in building a life that heals more than it conquers, and to never give up on us." They were pronounced husband and wife by a judge with kind eyes, and their kiss was quiet and decisive, like signing a good contract you've read carefully and love anyway. It felt like a closing and an opening at once, like doors flung wide and a room filling with sunlight. As the little reception melted into evening, lanterns casting little moons into the trees, Adrian took Nora's hand and led her to a corner where he'd hidden something under silk. "I have a wedding gift for you," he said, mischief and tenderness braided in his voice. He swept away the cloth. The small, moody landscape from the auction looked back at them with its soft storm and its pale line of hope. "I didn't buy it because I didn't want to lose to Ethan Vale," he said. She looked at him, and he met her eyes with a seriousness that made the air still. "I bought it because it was the first time I saw your eyes truly light up. It was the first time I saw the real you, the woman who loves art more than money, more than winning. I think I fell in love with you in that moment and didn't recognize what was happening." He looked at the painting and then at her again, the bottomless certainty of his love softening him to the core. "I knew I would do anything to see you look that happy again and again, for as long as I am lucky enough to be next to you." Tears spilled over, and she didn't even try to stop them. The gift wasn't a painting. It was proof that he had learned her. "Our 6-month contract is over," she teased, laughter threading through her tears. "Yes," he said, gathering her against him, kissing her under a sky blushed with twilight. "Now the lifetime contract begins." He grinned against her mouth, this man who had learned to be playful. "And the only condition," he murmured, "is that you never leave me." "Deal," she whispered, and sealed it with a kiss that promised more than forever. It promised a life built deliberately, brick by brick, with hope poured into the mortar. It promised that family secrets and toxic bargains and the drama of a millionaire's world could be turned into a foundation sturdy enough to hold love. The unexpected elements of their story, the storm, the photograph hidden in a silver frame, a rival's folder placed on the right table at the right time, had carried them through loss to hope again, and finally to the kind of breakthrough that changes not just two people, but the orbit of every room they ever walk into together.